Hello, Meissner makers. I want to share with you a really exciting community service initiative that we're participating in our Sacramento and our Santa Rosa locations. While I know a number of you do stitch and sew for charitable programs, I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you about the Rare Bears program. The Rare Bears program seeks to provide a little bit of something for children who have rare diseases that oftentimes are not the ones that we see with more of the mainstream research and charitable programs. So with the Rare Bear programs, a little huggable creature is stitched up for a child. They're serialized and they're sort of tracked through their lifetime. So we'll be having sew days on a monthly basis, both in the Santa Rosa location and in the Sacramento location. So speaking of sewing for children, I'd like to share with you today a technique for stitching on fine children's wear. And the same technique can be used for home dec projects as well. So we're going to take a look at how to make piping using our sewing machine. So today the piping that I'm going to make is a tiny little piping that's appropriate for edging on children's wear. It would also be really nice for women's garments, or if you're creating handbags and you need something that's just a little small accent piece. Now the exact same process would be used if you were creating a larger piping for pillows or home dec projects. The key to making your piping is to choose a presser foot with a guide underneath or a groove underneath that's approximately the same side as the cord that you're covering. Because we're covering very tiny cord today, I'm using a 5-groove pin tuck foot. That cord is going to sit right underneath the channel on the foot and hold it perfectly. If I were making piping that were a little bit larger, sort of a small home dec type of a cording, I might use my number 12 foot. I do recommend that you cut the fabric to cover the cord on the bias so that it'll have stretch around corners and around seams. It's going to be the most easy and forgiving for you to work with. Now, one mistake that I frequently see when people are making covered piping is they run that first row of stitching too close to the piping. They're trying to get up nice and tight. But you're going to end up stitching this piping 2 to 3 times before the final project is completed. So the first pass should be about 2 needle positions away from where you want the last pass. So the first pass is to cover the cord, the second is to attach it to the project, and then the third is to add that next layer of fabric, whether it's a bias strip or in the case of a pillow, a front and back. And that last pass is where you want to move your needle position right up close and tight to the piping, so that when your piping is flipped to the outside, you won't see any stitching from the first or the second pass of piping, and it'll be nice and tight and caught well in here. We start with a bias strip. I cut my bias strip the seam allowance that I'll need. So in this case I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Because the piping is folded over, I need to multiply that by 2. So the width of the seam allowance times 2 plus the thickness of the cord. This is a teeny little cord, so about 1/4 inch is plenty. If your cord is very large, then I would just run a tape measure around it to determine the finished width. So it's the diameter of the cord plus twice the seam allowance is the width that you want to cut your bias. In this case, because I'm using a pin tuck foot, I'm going to set the cord in the little groove that's just to the right of the needle and stitch. That groove in the pin tuck foot is going to hold my cording as I stitch. Now again, I'm leaving that needle position a little bit over to the right, so that when I stitch the piping to the project, this first row, which is in essence a basting row, is not going to show in my seam allowance. And then you're done. Now if I needed something that was really long, I would join my bias strips all at once before I cover the piping. But this is for tiny little sleeves on a child's garment, so I don't need a real long length. To attach the piping to the project, again, you generally have 2 layers of fabric that it's going to be encased in. In this case, it's going to be encased between this tiny little sleeve and a bias binding. I'm going to leave my needle position alone. I want all of the raw edges aligned. So my piping will still be a little loose in that bias, but that's okay, because we still have one more row of stitching to go. Bring the groove back down over the cord, and it's going to sit right in that little channel. I run 3 rows of stitching at the longest stitch length on my machine, gather them up and stitch over them. It does mean that you'll have some stitching or some gathering threads that will need to be removed when the project is done. But I found that this is the best way to get nice, even, soft gathers. But when I come back now with my bias binding, I will move that needle position 2 notches over to the left so that that cord will be nice and tightly encased within that bias.